Okay. Am I still delayed?
No?
Cool. Okay. This is a good sign.
Nice. Real-time Asia.
Real time. Oh my gosh. I don't even remember how we kicked off. How did we kick off?
You said that you have talked to several founders that have been in the same boat
Yes.
recently.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I've been having over the 8 years of running DemandMaven now, I've had several calls with founders who are in this like early go-to-market stage, meaning they are pre-product sometimes. Usually they're pre-revenue, or at least maybe they're like pre-first customers. Sometimes though they actually have customers, but they're like pre-launch. They have product, they have revenue, but they now need to launch. And there are many different, I think, versions of early go-to-market that you can be in. And based on those stages that you might be in, to me, there are several options that you have when it comes to like actually executing against your go-to-market strategy and thinking about like what partners, providers, options, et cetera, do you have or like can you put in place? And traditionally speaking, the most common approach usually is to hire like a full service agency. But for me, from my perspective, and I've seen hundreds of examples of this, dozens in this specific stage that go in a number of different directions. But I think agencies at this stage have a very special place. And I think unless you are aware of the trade-offs, you can create a lot of waste. A lot of waste. Like you're literally just setting cash on fire. Like you might as well like literally go light it on fire in your front yard. And it's painful for me to watch because like that is the thing I think that I really want to make sure that, especially if you're bootstrapped, that you don't kind of end up falling prey to in a way. And it's not like, there are agencies out there like trying to get you. I don't necessarily believe that. Certainly it happens, I'm sure. But I do think that there is like a right time and a right place at that early stage. And the reason why I say that is because if you are in that early go-to-market phase where you don't really understand your product market fit, what ends up happening is you end up spending a lot of money just to find out that you don't have it. And there are simpler, smaller, easier ways to learn that without spending 8 to 20K a month for 6 months and then kind of finding out later, like, none of this shit works because we're not, like, our product isn't ready, our messaging isn't ready, our positioning, etc., like our early acquisition channels, none of that is ready. And it's because we don't have like a solid understanding of how buyers interact with product. Now, many people kind of liken this to like chicken and egg, like where it's like, well, like you need people to kind of tell you that you're wrong or like you don't have it yet or what have you. And I do generally agree. Like, yes, like it needs to meet the sun and like people need to see it and use it and experience it. But I think that there are ways where you can do that without spending bukus and bukus of dollars. Like there are ways to get first impressions. There are that are much cheaper, much more effective cost wise, and ultimately can help you de-risk like whatever your launch plan or whatever like that early go-to-market strategy is going to be, and give you initial early feedback before you go and spend the next 50, 60K or whatever on ads, creative, landing pages, etc. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there are a lot of brands out there like that's what they should do. Like you should do that. But there are others where again, it's all about trade-offs. And like I just have a really strong reaction whenever there are organizations where it's like, yeah, maybe you guys should chill first before you go and spend like a bunch of money on an agency. Do that
And
maybe later, but yeah.
yeah. And so what are some indicators that you would know that? Like, is it just about money? Because what if, a company has a bunch of money and they could move really quickly and spend 100K and get data and then, have the agency execute in a different way on different channels. Like, so what are the
Yeah.
indicators?
So my first is number or volume of customers. If you have less than 25, 100 customers, you probably are going to feel like, yes, hiring an agency, spending a bunch of dollars and getting a lot of acquisition like fast is the right move. But I do think it depends on your context. I think that there are some products where you could totally do that. established software categories, I think that you probably can hire an agency and start the early go-to-market process. It won't be cost effective or efficient, but at least you will see a pulse on the other side. I think
Hmm.
for software categories that are less mature, or like everyone always says that they're building something new, but there's always something that your customers comparing you to. So I hear that, but I'm also like, when you actually do the research and talk to people, there's something else. There's always something else. Even if it's not software, there's something manual that they're doing. That's less ideal. But what we're looking for really is we're looking for, is there a pulse in this software category that we're in for the market that we're targeting? If we're finding that there's not as much of a audience, or there's not as much of like, there are other successful software in the category that we're in, then that tells me that our go-to-market strategy, when we do execute it, probably will need to be malleable. So it might not make sense, for example, to bring on like a big performance marketing ads agency if we don't see that our competitors are doing anything similar. But then similarly, like before we go and spend like 100K in like 3 months, what's like the minimum viable test where we can kind of see like, okay, like, is there life here? uh
Do you
so
see
that's the first.
agencies? Do you see agencies that will do that? Or typically it's just you're on a retainer and we're executing to the max?
I I think the best agencies are very strategic, not just about how they think about channels, but also about the clients they take on. I think there are a lot of really solid, well-performing agencies that the moment that they see like a client that's really early stage, they're naturally more cautious, because like it's not a good successful story to be like, oh yeah, I hired so and so agency and I spent, 6 figures and I got absolutely nothing. All we did was learn that we didn't have product market fit and we couldn't figure out how to get there. Like that's not a good story for anybody, right? I think the
Right.
best agencies are strategic and cautious to a degree. And I think that like the best partners are like, they're true partners in this, and they're cognizant and thoughtful about what makes sense for this business, given the market landscape, given the context we're in, et cetera. And the other thing too is I think like when, again, if you have zero customers, if you're starting from ground zero, I do think that there are more cost effective both partners and ways to start early. I do see some companies go the big agency route. So they're immediately going for like a full service. They're going to start spending 20 to 50K a month. And usually listen, like this isn't going to like put you out of business. But what it will do is it will burn your cash reserves. You'll probably have to raise earlier than what you want. You'll have a little bit less control over how that money is spent. And depending on, again, like your market context and your landscape, you might not emerge out of that with the insights that you need to make better decisions later. And that to me is one of the biggest risks, is like, not only
Mm.
do you spend all this money, you don't see the return and you don't learn anything. And I think like that to me is the worst. And it's very common. Now, do these SaaS companies or software companies like go out of business later, and like do they die because of this? No, not usually. But it is a scenario that creates a lot of discomfort later, because then the next time that you start to invest in marketing, you're naturally more skeptical. You're holding your cards a little bit closer to your chest, and that can create a different dynamic. And so any agency that comes after the first agency that you hire, it could be a mess sometimes. But it's interesting because, so like to answer your first question, like, yeah, the first thing I look for is like, do we have customers? Is this a software category that is relatively established or not? Do the competitors invest in these channels? And if they don't, why? But if they do, then what's our opportunity? The other thing that I look for is actually retention. So I'm looking for like, if we are, again, if we're very early stage, we're not going to have like big retention numbers here, meaning like, you might not have 6 months of data. You might not even have 3 months of data. But what I'm looking for is within that first 3 months of customer retention, is it pretty steady? Or do you lose half of your customers after the first 3 months? That also tells me that you do not want to spend a ton of money on ads or execution or agencies in this early stage, because you will lose 50% of anyone you convert anyway. which basically means, again, you're lighting cash on fire. And if
Right.
you don't have a really solid insights gathering process or like information or intelligence gathering process to learn from like why those people are churning, to really understand, well, what's the context that makes a great customer versus not, then you will continue to churn out that money. Like you will continue to waste. And that's this is the like thing that I want to wrap my arms the most around, because I think you do have to execute. Like you can't just like, tinker and like turn knobs like all day long. And like you can't just talk to customers and talk to prospects forever. Like you do have to actually put something on paper and present it to the world. You do eventually have to like come out of the cave and emerge into the sun. But what I strongly encourage is you have to be diligent about learning from whatever that execution is, whether it's big or small. And I think that there are some companies that do get lucky here. And again, like there are certainly signs of luck. You can spend the bukus of dollars, turn out customers, and then hey, like maybe like a good portion of them do retain. But I'm gonna say, just from my experience, that's not usually the case. It's usually either we spent bukus of money and we learned nothing, or we spent like a medium amount of money and we're learning some things, but it's not fast enough, or it's not like there's clearly something here. We're not gonna, go blow our budget or empty our pockets here. But it's usually like one or the other. And I think in that first case, I just want to strongly encourage, like, before you go and put in a ton of dollars into this, just like you have an MVP, I want you to think about, what's your minimum viable campaign? What's your minimum viable test to understand what this acquisition is going to do? Now, I do have some feelings about, like, if you don't have any customers, if this software category is relatively new or different, and you really are bringing a product to this market that is just like wildly different from what the incumbents are, or from what the incumbent behaviors are, then that is where I would say you want to de-risk this as much as possible. Like I wouldn't even, like, ads are one of the quickest, easiest ways to kind of see, like, is there life here? But it's also one of the quickest and easiest ways to create false positives and false negatives, meaning it might give you the feeling of, falsely, that like, yeah, you've got something here. Like, yep, this product fits people's needs perfectly. But then when you look at retention, or when you look at conversion rates, or when you look at like the types of people that you're actually getting through that pipeline, they might not actually be the best fit for the product in the first place. It also could create false negatives, meaning you've built this product for this audience, but based on the way that you ran the ads, you might not be attracting those people. And it might make you think, oh, that those people don't like my product, or they don't find value out of it. But actually, it just wasn't positioned and marketed well. Like it wasn't, like, maybe you had the wrong messaging. Maybe something about the landing page threw them off. Like it could be any number of things. And that might make you assume that this is not the right audience or what have you, when actually it probably is. We're just not doing the best job on the marketing side. And that needs to get updated. But again, you might create a false negative. Similarly, you could create false positives as well. And that is where I would say that's the most risk to me, because if you don't know what a good customer looks like yet, but you don't go through the process to really understand that, then you might end up kind of getting derailed a bit. And it can become a very stressful, painful, long process. I have worked with founders who have toiled endlessly in this space, and they don't know what direction to go because they keep getting false positives and false negatives like left and right. And that can be very confusing. All I want to say though, so I do, like I said, like I think when agencies are like a hell yes, are when you have clear indications of product market fit. But I want to be careful here, because I think I have conversations too with founders where they're like, we have product market fit. But then we look at like their long-term retention, and it's like 50% 12-month NRR. And it's like, you don't have product market fit. I'm sorry, you just don't. There's nothing you can tell me to convince me that you have PMF. You don't. Because if you had PMF, they would stay for longer than a year. So either your model's broken, the product is not a fit, or the customers aren't a fit. Something here is not aligned. It could be all three of them. It could be just one of them, but something here is broken fundamentally. So like, again, like when I hear, oh, we have product market fit, but we've only had customers for 3 months, and it's like 3-month NRR is like 50%. I'm like, you don't. That's cute that you think that you do, but you don't. now the next step is really to kind of figure out who are the long-term customers, and you're really not actually going to know until like a year or two. And
Mm.
I like, I don't think that founders hear me when I say that, but you're not actually going to understand your product market fit until you have a full year's worth of data. So if you've launched, you've got customers, and you're 3 months later, you're 4 months later, you're 4 months in, and you're like, we've got PMF. I guarantee you don't know that yet. Even if you've got like 100% 4-month NRR, you still don't know. You're not going to know until month 12. You just won't. And then if it's less than 50%, that tells me like, okay, we got to, something is amiss. We don't have PMF yet, but maybe you have enough product market fit, because product market fit is ever changing. It's always evolving, but maybe you have enough product market fit that, yeah, like you can invest in marketing, you can invest in acquisition, and you can start to see maybe like that you retain people for at least 6 months. But the way that your like sales or marketing cycle ends up being, it actually could be like net positive, meaning like you still gain people faster than you lose them, and it continues to get better every time. Like it continues to get more efficient over time. Like that's still a positive sign, even if you don't have like incredible NRR. But like I said, most companies don't have incredible NRR for several years, but that's just because it takes time to build that, right? Like, so all that to say, I grate my teeth whenever I hear we have PMF, but you've only ever had customers for 3 months. You actually don't know yet. And I know that there's the survey that you can run, like that's like the PMF survey where you ask people, how disappointed would you be if we left and we went away? And it's like, oh, I'd be very disappointed. And it's like, okay, great. That's one metric. There are like 2 to 3 others that I look for signs of positive product market fit. I think that's one qualitative way to understand it. I do think it's a good way. It's not the only way. NRR, I think, is your other solid metric here. But anyway, I digress.
So are these founders you're talking to, are they kind of thinking, all right, it's either agency, like I either got to pay an agency or I need to pay like a consulting firm, a growth firm, like a DemandMaven? In their mind, is it like one or the other?
Yeah, which is interesting. Yes, usually, and I would say usually it's like, they want strategy and execution, which makes sense. If you're early stage go to market, yeah, you should be executing like that. That I think makes sense. What my caution to the wind, however, is my my flag that I fly is always and forever going to be okay, but like let's make sure we're not just blowing cash, because it's so easy to do that by accident and not even really realize until later, oh man, that was super wasteful. We probably didn't need to do that. Now, I will say there are certainly companies out there that do just get lucky and they can spend all the money and the bukus of dollars and yada yada.
Right.
But
Or
I
don't
think
realize they're wasting cash.
that's certainly possible. But I think like what I think is interesting though about those companies is, I mean, maybe they do get lucky. They don't do as much of that like qualitative understanding or insights gathering, or maybe they don't do like a long stealth mode period. But when I think about like Superhuman was building for like what, 3 to 4 years straight, and then it kind of seemed like they came out of nowhere, but they really didn't. They actually spent 3 to 4 years really honing and perfecting the product and like refining their craft and really deeply understanding who are the best possible customers. But they didn't spend bukus of dollars on acquisition. They invested very heavily into product and engineering, and they did it quietly for years and years and years until all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it seemed like they came out of thin air, but they really didn't. They had been quietly hacking away for a long time. And I love the story of Superhuman because Superhuman feels like it's everywhere. I can't think of the word that describes that well, but it feels like Superhuman is like part of the fabric now of a lot of SaaS companies.
Right.
But they had quietly created their luck, and I think like that's a very different scenario than we're going to kind of come out the gate. We don't actually understand who our best paying customers are because we're not. Maybe it doesn't make sense to kind of take that more strategic approach or gradual approach, and I think that's why I admire Superhuman so much, because they could have not. They had the funding. They could have done big splashes. They could have I guess shot their shot much earlier, but they didn't because they really wanted to make sure that they de-risked it as much as possible. They also had a big vision. They have a big market, obviously, but I think like that's where you would take your time. And that's where you would kind of like refine a little bit, slow down a little bit, and really make sure that you understand this before you go and, do a big splash. Because the big splash, there's tons of studies about this, but once that big splash is done, you're kind of left with like this crater. And then assuming that you've built the right thing for the right people, you'll start to see it climb back up over time. Most companies don't have that though. Usually it's just like a flat line, and it's like nothing. Like you basically have to like do another big splash to see anything happen. But you did it right if you have the big splash. It does kind of crater a bit, but then it starts to creep back up over time, and it almost feels like you don't have to work that hard to do it. And I think like that's the sign of like, yep, you've got early product market fit. You understand your acquisition channels, you understand your buyer, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, going back to your question though, founders, I think, kind of come to the problem of early go-to-market thinking, okay, we've done the strategic work, now we execute. But what I think is actually more true is you're actually always doing the strategic work. The execution is really what needs to be as flexible as possible, because you will change your mind. You're going to learn things. You're going to want to be able to kind of move things around and massage things around. And what I worry about is, like, it's one thing if you have a partner that's not flexible, like an agency that might not like, but the thing about it is like flexibility has a cost. And yeah, like your agency can rebuild your whole website if you find that you got the messaging wrong, or like actually there's a better paying customer over here. Let's go and build for that audience. Now you got to redo everything. Like that, all those things have a cost. And I think like for some it makes sense, but for a lot it doesn't. So I almost would rather founders think of maybe a different model where they actually instead maybe bring on like contractors, freelancers, like individuals. Like if you know that hiring the big fancy agency right now is just not going to be in the budget, because again, like you're going to spend at least 8K a month, 5 if you are very, very focused, but like 5K a month would be on the low end, in my opinion. That would be like maybe a channel, and probably not even ads, because ads easily gets up to 15K per month minimum. But yeah, like you're going to probably be spending at least like 8K a month, but it can easily get up to like 20 to 30. And again, if you don't have strong product market fit, a lot of that will go to waste. Which to me is like, that's the thing that I hate the most, is the waste, especially because there's more effective ways to figure it out. But anyway, I digress. So to me, yeah, like there's an opportunity to build like an internal team that maybe is not full time, but would be more cost effective. You'd be able to iterate and move faster, even though you don't have this like fully scaled out agency. Now, to be fair, I think agencies are really good at just like kind of launching into action. And I think when you're ready for that, it's amazing. I love my agency partners. Like I am not knocking them at all. But I do think that there is a right time and a right place for them, depending on who they are and like what their strengths are. But I think that there's another option that maybe founders don't consider enough, and that is kind of building like your own internal team. So before you bite off on like a really big expense, before you understand like what your acquisition strategy should be, because it's expensive and it's getting more expensive every day, there is actually a way, in my opinion, to kind of build an internal practice to test ideas. And you might, there are some certainly agencies who take like an iterative approach and take an experimental approach. Like there's an agency that we're working with right now on ads for my fractional CMO role. And I love the incremental approach that they take, because I never feel like they are, like bowling me over with 20 million more ideas and spending more money. Like I always feel like they're very aligned with where we're at and with what our budget is going to be. And I think that like there are certainly partners out there that are like that. And then there are partners out there that are the total opposite. They're like, here's the next thing, here's the next thing, here's the next thing. And that, like I said, I think that there's a time and a place for all those partners. I don't think it's always the early go-to-market stage though. And I think that's the message that I want to impart to anyone who's in that space is, let's really think about what you actually need. And let's also really think about how confident you are that this is it. And you don't need to do more qualitative or insights gathering or understanding. Granted, like you're still going to do that anyway, but maybe the lift isn't as big as you think it is. And similarly, maybe it actually is bigger than you think it is. And launching into execution to a certain scale and size might not make sense. And I think that's where the risk is and the trade-offs are. And if you don't have a big budget, there's a lot of waste that can happen. And I think also too, if you've raised, and like this makes me cringe too, because it's also very common, but like sometimes like you raise like $1 million or whatever, or 2 million, and your first instinct is to hire the big fancy agency. And it's just like, okay, let's pause for a minute and like really think about it, because you will waste money. Like it's going to happen. You might waste a lot less though if you considered other options, and there are other options, especially
Right.
if there's higher risk.
Yeah. And it feels so enticing if you have the money or you just got funding, because it's so turnkey for a bigger agency, which can be
Yes.
great. A little bit more thought from the founders leadership team on if you're going to pull together, like what you suggested, some contractors or freelancers, right?
Right.
Just takes a little bit more. But also thinking about like, what are the incentives of the bigger agencies? And of course, they're big and there's so many great sides to that. But also, like, the incentive is to keep that retainer for as long as possible. That works out for everybody. That works out for them in that case. Not to say that they're snakes or anything, but that's just the model.
Yeah, it's how it works. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. So it's good advice for you to have founders be thoughtful. You don't necessarily, it seems like it could be easy, more turnkey, but there might be a more metered approach.
Definitely a more metered approach. And to me, again, like agencies are a hell yes to me when you do have really clear signs, the ones that I described of product market fit. So you have a very strong NRR. You like, yeah, like you can run the PMF survey, and like most people are extremely disappointed in the actual segment that you're targeting. All of that's great. If you have those signals, those quantitative signals, and also possibly qualitative, that to me is like, okay, yeah, like you might be ready. The other thing that I would say would be true too is you're not spending too much money on trying to figure out what the channels are, because that's expensive. There's going to be an episode that we do that's like, can you be too early to a marketing channel? And the answer is absolutely yes, especially like if the rest of your go-to market is not as mature as maybe acquisition. Acquisition, I think, does mature with the rest of the business. So you can be too early to a channel. But what I think is also interesting too is you really, it's so tricky, but like there's more cost effective ways to test acquisition strategies without necessarily spending, I don't want to call it like the overhead, but there is a margin, and that agencies have to meet, and that might not be the most cost effective way. And in fact, I find if you have ACVs or LTVs that are on the lower side, I would argue that that's actually not the best way initially, because you really do like need a pretty efficient funnel actually happening, especially if you're PLG, where that cost makes sense. Now, if you have higher ACVs and minimum people are spending 5, 10, 15K with you like per year, then yeah, like you will see probably very early ROI. It might not be super efficient yet, but at least like you might see very early ROI from partners, like agency partners and things like that. But if you're like on the lower end and you're like self-service PLG, you don't have like a sales motion yet, I have a hard time saying yes, go agency, unless they are a very specific focused agency, because like SEO is the answer, like paid acquisition is the answer, but chances are you might not know. But that's why I argue, let's figure out like what are minimum viable campaigns or minimum viable tests to see like is there life here before we go and we spend a bunch of money on something, because it's very expensive to figure out what your acquisition channels are through an agency versus saying we have data that suggests that partnerships, ads, and affiliates are the way to go. So now help us like scale that out. That to me is a very different space and a better position to be in than, I don't know, guys, what's it going to cost for me to figure it out? And it's like, well, it's going to cost you a lot because we got to try a million things and we're not necessarily going to understand like how it all works. And then I find like most agencies really don't hit their stride, much like any new employee or contractor or freelancer. Most folks don't hit their stride until like month 3 and 4. So
Mm.
you are going to pay for people to learn. And I think that there are some scenarios where that's much more cost effective than others. Again, not knocking agencies at all, but you have to think about like, this is what their model is. And unless you have like really clear signals of like product market fit, but also just stability in your business, it's just going to be more expensive. You're going to spend way more than what you might bargain for, unless, of course, you do have a clear understanding of what those channels probably are, because maybe you've run tests or like you've run experiments. And there are certainly providers, consultants. And this is kind of what I think I'm suggesting is I almost would rather founders go with consultants, contractors, and freelancers first to really understand performance first before you really invest and scale out something. Because again, you will pay to learn, but you could pay a lot less to learn, especially if you approached it that way. I think that's what really all I'm saying. But no, I mean, like I said, I love our agency partners. And I'm not saying that, they're like evil or anything. You should absolutely hire agencies. But I think that there are specific times and points in the journey where you do. And, they're obviously awesome to do that with.
Yeah. And what you're saying is that early on, you're going to have to be very involved and in tune anyways. So you're spending the time, whether it's with an agency or with freelancers, contractors, because of the stage of the
Right.
business, right? So
Exactly. I think in terms of where we fit, obviously, like we've supported business in that early go-to-market stage. I think where we really work super well on the early go-to-market side is when we do product discovery work. So if you're pre-product and you're trying to figure out what are the requirements for this product in order for it to be successful, we're amazing there. There is also go-to-market strategy. So before you go and invest and drop a bunch of money on an agency to test a bunch of channels and kind of willy-nilly, I'm not going to say that they're not strategic. There are certainly strategic agency partners that are out there, but what we find is they usually don't have the specialty and the focus that we do when we do go-to-market work for specifically like SaaS PLG companies, which I think is a key difference. However, if there's like what is the initial plan or like the initial strategy or like the initial messaging approach? So it is in a way kind of like product marketing work. And also we're really making sure that pricing and model makes a lot of sense. It's like, are we charging the right things in the most ideal way for the type of buyer that we're hoping to actually acquire? And then similarly, we do actually go out and get feedback from the market itself on, is this product ready? Is this something that would ultimately solve your jobs to be done or solve your problem as it is now? Or are you looking for other things, or do you feel like this doesn't actually solve the problem? And there are ways that we do that gives us the absolute best insight and also like removes as much bias as possible, because most people don't want to tell you that your product sucks. They'd rather just ghost and not say anything. Like that's just the way it is. But there are ways that we can validate some assumptions, but also invalidate some things as well. So we can debunk a lot of myths and realign kind of like what the truth or as close to objectivity as we possibly can be. And then after that, we might say, okay, like now let's get on this freelancer or contractor or consultant based on like these specific hypotheses. And so instead of spending like the 20K per month, you may actually come in at about like half that, just like to learn the same things and not spend nearly as much or waste as much time. So I think like if that's an approach that is really attractive to you, that's where we fit really well. But I will say though, and I turn founders away all the time when I'm like, listen, like you should hire the agency. That sounds great. Like go and do the thing. Because they're going to be able to scale up and like move way faster than this more like methodical approach. But if you don't have like those positive like quantitative signals, super like a really engaged strong customer base that are retaining, again, like you're gonna want a more methodical approach. Like my recommendation would not be to jump into that bed too early. But if you do have really strong signals, then it very well could be. And also not just strong signals, but you also have strong ideas for what channels you would invest in or test. I think if you have that combination, an agency could make a lot of sense because you're decreasing the risk of spending like a bunch of money to kind of learn and that be very pricey, because in order for most agencies to learn, like they are going to actually execute it, and that requires resources.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you probably can hedge your bets better if you do have those positive signals. But if you don't, that's where I would recommend, like, let's be a little bit more methodical about this. And let's make sure we double check our assumptions and myth bust as much as possible before we kind of put all of our eggs into a basket. But anyway, so that's my very passionate spiel about, does it make sense to hire an agency at this time? I think the answer is it depends based on your context, but I've given some signals that make sense. So we have a really strong net revenue retention mark at the 6 and 12 month mark. If you don't have that much data, maybe wait a little bit, because if you see things drop off after month 4, that to me says you're not ready for spending big buku dollars on agencies. Similarly, you have no idea what channels to try. That okay, well, you got to spend time exploring that before you go and again spend a bunch of money trying to figure that out and like learn the hard way. The other thing that I'd be looking for is, yeah, like you could certainly run like the product market fit survey, but what I would really be looking for is, do you consistently have a buyer type that any resource, not just an agency, but any resource, a marketer, product marketer, copywriter, freelancer, could start to create assets, collateral, messaging around that does acquire like the right type of person. What we also see is in those early days, there are like 5 different customer segments that we could go after, but it's not clear which one is actually the best one for us for now. And that's another tricky situation, because again, you're going to spend a lot of money trying to attract all these people. And actually, maybe 1 out of 5 is going to actually be a good fit. So that's the other thing that I'd be looking for. Is there anything that I missed? I feel like that was pretty much the list.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was it.
There are other things that are a little bit harder to define, but I do look for like clear product vision. I think if you're always going to kind of, be figuring out what the right product is as well. You're going to certainly change and adjust and evolve over time. But yeah, I think like those are the very specific things that I look for that kind of tells me like, okay, yep, you're ready to really invest. I also think too, like pricing is going to have a huge impact on how you think about investment into acquisition. There are some that are just not going to move as quickly as you think it will. So again, if you have like a higher ACV, like you're charging more for your product, especially if you're B2B, then you probably can get away with the risk of hiring agencies and things like that and kind of investing in execution early. If you have lower ACVs, I would be really looking at de-risking as much as possible. Like if you're only charging like $20 a month for your product, well, one, I kind of already know what your channels probably are, but then also like we should be reducing as much risk as possible, because the margin on that is going to be so tight and you won't see immediate ROI, which means that first 6 months will probably be kind of tough. So all that to say, like we really want to make sure that we're being methodical about that in that situation.
Nice.
Cool.
I think that's good advice.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you, Kim, for listening and like talking me through that and asking really good questions. I appreciate it as always.
Yeah. Thanks for the advice, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks again. Bye. All right.